I was the most grassroots thing you could possibly imagine. I was there at the freaking 7-Eleven, putting up posters. They'd get ripped down. Go back the next day, put them up. I was on the radio station every morning at 8 a.m. I mean, this is KTKE, which is like where the radio station was in the back of like a barbecue joint. And I was there trying to explain, yoga, music, nature. I got it at least that simple. Yoga, music, nature. You get that? People are like, huh? What? Yoga and music and the nature? I don't get it. But I did that, for 50 days or something. And then the night, Michael Franti, who was our headliner, and the night before his headlining show, first year festival, burst his appendix.
Hey friends, welcome back to the At the End of the Tunnel podcast. In this episode, you're going to hear from someone who began his journey in the music industry. And through an unlikely series of events, one being having an office just a few blocks away from the former World Trade Center in New York in September of 2001, that experience led him to become one of the first to bridge the gap between yoga, wellness, and music. His name is Jeff Krasno, and you may have heard of the worldwide movement that he started many years ago called Wanderlust. Well, Jeff is going to take us through that journey as well as how it evolved into his more recent movement, which is called One Commune. And just a heads up, our interview is just a little bit longer than usual because Jeff is such an amazing storyteller. And as I was listening to his story, I found it to be such a relevant example of how pretty much all of the so-called random events that we experience in life, stuff like getting bullied as a child, to being a pothead as a young adult, to making and selling homemade guacamole at random bluegrass festivals. These kinds of moments, when we look at them in hindsight, are almost always contributing something along our path that we're going to eventually use later on to be of service in some unexpected way. And Jeff's story just kept going to all of these remarkable places that ended up circling back around to the founding of Wanderlust. And I wanted you to experience all of it in context. So, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce you to the venerable Mr. Jeff Krasno. So Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. As always, I like to start these conversations by talking about childhood. And so the question that we'll kick it off with is, can you recall what your favorite toy or activity was as a child?
Well, I was super into Batman. And I was living overseas most of my childhood. So when I was in Brazil, I think it was Batman. And I would dress up as Batman. I have one younger brother. He wasn't born yet at that point. So it was kind of just me and my parents. And we moved around a tremendous amount. We moved, I think, 11 times before I was 7 or 8. So that was a very diverse, cultural, peripatetic kind of youth all over Europe and then in South America and in Brazil, mostly moving around to a bunch of different places in Rio. But that's the most coherent memory I have. And then I think that there was another cartoon character called Speed Racer. I was really into that too. My father worked for the Ford Foundation in Rio, and the Ford Foundation was responsible for bringing Sesame Street to Latin America. So that was one of his jobs. To bring like Grover and Big Bird and Kermit and that cast of characters to South America, have those things originally translated into Portuguese, into Spanish, but then they became localized themselves and they were producing down there. So that was a fun experience.
If I could talk to little 6 or 7-year-old Jeff, what would he say was so appealing about Batman? Why Batman?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fine question. I think that there's got to be a superpower component to it that, Batman was not confined to the same rules and regulations of the normal human condition. And I also think that he got to dress up in this fantastic outfit and wear a cape and wear a mask. And that was the other thing. When I look back, there's a whole series of photos of me as a young kid, both in Spain and in Brazil, dressed up as a torero, this kind of matador outfit where, I had the whole outfit and the hat and the cape. So I think there was, a dress up component to it that seemed pretty appealing at that time.
I'm sure the car didn't help. I mean, didn't hurt either, right? The Batmobile.
The Batmobile, yeah, I had a lot of those kind of cars, that was a big thing, that whole, it was like Tyco or whatever, had all of those trucks and cars. I had a lot of those. I'd like to smash them up quite a bit, as I suppose a typical young boy is apt to do.
Tell me a little bit about the moving around. What was that about? I know you said your dad worked for the Ford Foundation, so it sounds like you were a child of the world. I know you speak French now. I don't know if that's something you learned back in those days, or what was that? What was your childhood like in terms of your family dynamic and whatever that was causing you guys to move around?
Yeah, the French I actually learned later in life when Skylar and we moved to Paris mid-college, but certainly the kind of neuroplasticity, I think or the rivers in my brain that I think made me fairly adept at picking up languages was developed when I was a kid. My dad was a Fulbright professor, so he was essentially getting grants to teach psychology, first at the University of London, and then in Spain, we moved to a little town called Santiago de Compostela, which is a beautiful old town. So, just I guess to rewind, I was born in Chicago on Thanksgiving Day at the Lying In Hospital, which was at the University of Chicago.
That's where I was born.
No, really?
Yeah. 3 years later.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
And my parents grew up in Chicago, just outside of Chicago. They both went to Evanston Township High School and were, high school sweethearts. I got married really young, as was the custom back in that day. And they were finishing at Stanford. So then we moved to Palo Alto and then we moved overseas. And we ended up, when my dad was got the Fulbright grant to go to the University of London, we actually moved up to the Lake District in northern England, which was very, very rural. And we rented this kooky, amazing property that was, property of the Queen. I think everything up there in some way was property of the Queen. And it was bucolic in the sense of, the reality was go outside and, pick blackberries and come in and make jam. And I was really into cement mixers and working around the property. There's a ton of photos of me. Every photo of me has a shovel. I was just loved to shovel. And I had a little tiny miniature horse called Maybe. And so I, just because I couldn't name it and people were throwing different suggestions to me and my response was always Maybe. So it just became Maybe. And then, moving to Spain and then Brazil. And it was wonderful from the standpoint of kind of opening me up as a child to other cultures, certainly other languages.
So you were fluent in Spanish and fluent in Portuguese?
Yeah, at a really pretty young age. And, part of it is certainly the supple, absorbent mind of a young person tends to soak in language quickly. But I think that there was another piece afoot, which is that, as a kid, I just wanted to fit in. And, that was the difficult part, is that, we were bouncing from location to location. I'd have to quickly sponge in fluency around a new language, start a new school, and then 6 months later would be in another place.
Do you remember finding that exciting, or do you feel like that was a hassle and you kind of didn't look forward to it as a kid?
Well, it was, I suppose, exciting, although I didn't really know any better at that juncture. I think that was what I just thought life was about. You just kind of tagged along with your parents. I was also a chubby kid, significantly chubby. And so when we moved to Rio, I had some difficulty there just because I was 5 or 6 years old. I had a paunch belly that would kind of hang over, the belt of my jeans, and my, thighs would chafe enough to kind of, create some kind of threadbareness on the denim, that kind of, and I was teased, quite a bit. And so there are a couple of incidents that stick out that I remember quite clearly.
Can you talk about those?
Yeah, I can. I went to the American school in Rio, in Gavia, which is a lovely part of Rio. And I think I was 5 or 6. And there was a school bully, kind of a playground bully, named Babito. And of course, it's like central casting, right? And the student mix at the American school was kind of a smattering of foreign nationals, Americans, but mostly Brazilians, mostly Brazilian families that, wanted their kids to speak English. So the classroom itself, kind of the linguistic currency was English, but the playground was strictly Portuguese, and a very particular kind of slangy Portuguese known as carioca, which is, native to Rio itself. So, there was this playground slang and camaraderie that existed really amongst the Brazilian kids. And there was one ritual on the playground that most all the kids partook in some way, but I sort of assiduously avoided it. But there was a sloped area of the playground, and this ritual would be like the kids would run along the grass. As they came upon the slope, they'd kind of hurtle themselves forward and land on their butts and sort of skid down this hill, to the point that after time, there was sort of a dirt landing strip sort of developed over time, just from use. And Babito was kind of the main conductor, kind of orchestrator of this ritual. And he'd get everyone queued up and whatnot. And I was always off to the side because my physique did not lend itself well to hurtling myself down the hill. I was not accustomed to that sort of nimble, dexterous movements. But one particular day, I summoned enough confidence to get in the line and kind of just sort of tentatively approach the hill and launch myself forward and land on my butt. And, I wasn't going to set any distance records, but I managed to get down the hill with a couple of cheers of Americano, and so I kind of trudged back up the hill, kind of now brimming with a little bit more confidence, and queued back up and sort of tightened my belt a notch and sort of pulled my polo down over my belly. And this time with more verve, made the approach, I kind of launched myself forward, landed, and then heard this sound that echoed, that stopped all other phenomena. It's amazing how sort of the brain can process sound into material reality very quickly. And I immediately knew that I had ripped my jeans down my ass crack all the way. And kind of what's more, as was the custom back then, and you probably back me up, is that there wasn't like boxer briefs or anything. No. I had tighty whities. That's just what you wore. There's nothing else. Right. And I had ripped my pants to such a degree that my tighty whities now had taken up a deep brown stain from the dirt landing strip. Yeah. And of course, this sent our good friend Babito into paroxysms of joy and laughter. And he started a playground-wide refrain, "The American shat his pants," which echoed kind of over and over. And I stood there at the bottom kind of the hill, sort of with deep embarrassment and kind of self-loathing and biting my lip, eyes welled, trying not to burst into tears, and immediately sort of into fight or flight mode, or in this case, sort of trying to angle myself most appropriately so to limit the availability to my shit-stained underwear, and kind of shuffled off the playground and kind of limped into the nurse's office and complained of some ailment.
Made up ailment so you can go home.
Made up ailment. Of course, she was like, "Oh, that headache must have made you shit your pants." It's like, "No, it's not that." Like, and my mother, was summoned and, dutifully picked me up. And I kind of remember that sort of walk of shame back across the playground with my backpack sort of awkwardly slung low on my back, in an attempt to kind of camouflage this awful accident, and, getting into the car with the sort of last fading refrains of "The American shat his pants." That story became really emblematic of my childhood, and kind of later in life, more recently, as I've done some kind of psychological excavation into my own life and trauma and psychoses or what have you. There was this kind of thirst to fit in when you're a child. It's hyperbolized, I think, when you're a kid, because, you've come out of the womb, from a place of utter, complete unity. And then, your umbilical cord is severed and your life trudges slowly towards separation. And all you want is that feeling sort of oneness, and to be held and to belong, to be loved. And so off you go, and, life is beautiful and cruel. And in my particular case, I just didn't have any friends because we were moving so much. My only friends were my parents, and they were also busy. So really that quest to fit in and really to assimilate was a huge part of growing up for me. And I didn't have the tools to recognize the difference between fitting in and belonging.
You must have gotten good, though, I would imagine, at, because you could take that incident and you could literally put that on any playground in the world, and you would have the same characters, and you probably would get the same reaction from the kids. There would be the Babito character, whatever his name would be, depending on the culture you're in. And so you must have gotten really good at sort of reading the landscape and knowing who the people were that you wanted to befriend first, and who the bullies were, and who the whole kind of political dynamic of the neighborhood and of the schoolyard.
Oh, yes. There were the Jungian archetypes were recognizable quickly, particularly the shadow archetypes, the bully,
The outsiders.
The outsiders. And then, of course, there's the nurturing nurse and all of the, sort of characters that sort of make up, this bigger play. And, I think that in retrospect, I did a lot. My life was very dominated by strategies to fit in, and in some ways to change who I was in order to feel a sense of acceptance. And also not really knowing who I was, because was I Spanish? Was I Brazilian? Was I English? Was I American? I don't know. What was my native language at that juncture? I didn't really have one. So, I spoke Portuguese much better than I spoke English by the time, we were in Brazil for 3 years. So, I think there was a sort of like questioning of identity. And obviously now that I have, I suppose, some more sophisticated tools to kind of psychoanalyze myself or do some personal inventory, part of me is very critical of my younger self, kind of the self-loathing, always seeking the approval of others, kind of defining myself through what other people thought of me. Part of me is like, well, why didn't, you just have the self-esteem, the sense of your own identity, not to care about that stuff? But of course, you can't expect that as a child. And I was just using the tools that I had as my survival mechanism. My tools were like, okay, I know how to be a chameleon. I know how to speak all these languages. Even just, this is a podcast, so it doesn't lend itself perfectly to visual techniques, but you've seen me, just what I look like. I look like I could be almost from anywhere. It's like my skin color completely belies my genetics. I'm like 5 shades darker than anyone in my family. And in a way, it's like I somehow cultivated this persona or this ability to chameleonize myself to be almost anyone from anywhere, to the point where, and I don't want to skip over too much, but because there's a lot of points along the way. But I remember when I was maybe 40 and I got into a cab with my daughters, and I recognized on some subconscious level that the cab driver was Jamaican, and immediately took on an accent of like, take me uptown, man. And like, he's looking at me completely confused and somewhat pitifully. And my kids are looking at me like horrified and embarrassed. And I'm like examining myself of like, holy shit, I just take on the affect of anywhere that I am, because all I want to do is connect. All I want to do is fit in or belong. And again, I think in retrospect, it gave me very useful tools, because in the end of the day, my whole life, the common thread of my entire life has been about building community, about fostering community, from my days in the music business to Wanderlust to commune. And so, I think that these are, in some ways, it's easy to look at character defects to be very self-critical.
Sure.
And I am. And then I've also learned how to show myself some empathy and realize that often we're just doing things, we're using and leveraging the tools we have to best survive.
So when you look at your childhood as a one experience, how would you describe that experience in its totality in terms of like mental health or just the way? And I'm not talking about the adult Jeff looking back as a child, but as a child when you were actually maybe about to graduate from high school or whatever. How would you describe what you were about to leave behind when you were going to Columbia University?
Yeah, well, there was an inflection point in my life that was noticeable in and of its time. So essentially, I carried around the persona of the fat kid until I was 13. And I had friends. I mean, I don't want to paint like a big pity party on your show. I had friends, and I was playing tons of sports and, doing well in school, so then I moved to Connecticut at this juncture after a whole bunch of other layovers, if you will. We lived in DC and Miami, but then we kind of put down some roots, and I was doing okay, but there was this, I was always essentially like the fat kid, the fat friend. That was my persona in life. That was the character, the script that I had. I had friends that were going out with all the popular girls, and I was kind of on the periphery of that and but I was always that character. And when I was 13, I developed this tumor on my knee, and it turned out to be a malignant tumor. And there's a whole long, convoluted and complicated story around that piece of my life, but I ended up in the pediatrics ward at Sloan Kettering, which is a cancer hospital in New York, a very well-known cancer hospital. And I was 13, so I could have been put in an adult ward. I could have been in pediatrics, but basically I was just trying to find a bed to have this procedure as quickly as possible. So the bed that was available was in pediatrics. And pediatrics at Sloan Kettering is generally a one-way street. I had a fibrous histiocytoma. This was like a relatively not particularly serious, relatively topical tumor. Yes, it could have metastasized. It could have gotten worse. But in comparison to everybody else in that ward, I mean, we're talking terminal, we're talking 8-year-olds weighing 30 pounds with terminal leukemia kind of stuff. And I had a roommate during my tenure there who did pass away. So coming out of the other side, as I was literally wheeled out of Sloan, I was a new human, and I suppose I became like an adult, but I didn't really have a lot of self-awareness. I just kind of realized on some level that I was lucky. And I came home. There was quite a significant recuperation period at home. And my parents decided that it was best for me to go away to boarding school. They were not satisfied with the level of education that I was getting kind of at the public schools where we lived. And of course, I fought this with every ounce of energy that I had, to the point where I think I smashed a few windows, and they retreated and let me back in public school for a week until I made my own decision to actually leave, which I did do. But through the process of the recuperation from, my medical ordeal, I had lost a ton of weight. I was now a skinny person, but I saw fat Jeff. That's who I was, that's it. So I went away to this boarding school called Hotchkiss. It was up in northwestern Connecticut. Beautiful, incredible place. And, in the second week of school there, to be crass, I had all the hot girls, all over me. And I'm like, what the fuck is going on? Why me? I'm the fat guy, and my life totally changed around, and in some ways that were kind of scary and dangerous. So, I kind of got into sort of a fast scene with kind of this international New York jet setty, wealthy scene niche. But, I was, for a couple of years, sort of the king of the world. And it changed my whole outlook and my whole identity around myself. And I became much more confident, just had a lot more self-esteem. And that was a big inflection point.
Talk a little bit about music, man. What was your experience with music when you were growing up?
Yeah, it was a major part of my life. My grandfather was a cardiologist and quit cardiology to become a gypsy violinist at around in his late 50s, which wasn't the most fiscally responsible decision.
Right.
But he was just passionate. I mean, just absolutely consumed with music. He'd play all day, every day, any gig, didn't matter. And so, and he played, gypsy violin. So it was highly emotional, bordering on schmaltzy, but technical and often instrumental. That was very influential to have a musician, in the family. And then my dad was very talented, just naturally. He never kind of applied it to the development of a lot of technique, but I would say his spiritual well was deeper than his technical well. But but music was around, and on the weekends, my house was always, and this was in Connecticut, so it's maybe 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, that kind of age. And my parents' house was kind of the epicenter for the neighborhood party scene. And there was a lot of musicians in the neighborhood, and on a regular Friday and Saturday night, folks just sitting around drinking beers, playing music. That was very, very normal. Yeah. And it was just around me. And I suppose my approach to learning languages was a musical approach, was a sonic approach. It wasn't a more pedagogic sort of vocabulary approach. I was listening to sounds, processing sounds, and connecting sounds to meaning. I wasn't studying and learning them out of a textbook. Mm-hmm. And, I think that helped give me, some sort of a ability. I think it helped develop my ear. And so, yeah, I was always playing music. And in high school and then in college, I got, more serious about it, and happy to talk kind of more about that. But yeah, it was a very big part of my life. And, my brother became a professional musician, and I ended up managing him for 12 or 13 years. So
you ended up going to Columbia. That's where you met Skylar, correct?
Yeah, we did. We met in freshman year. We were in the same dorm, which was McBain, which was, I would call it the fringe accommodations at Columbia. And yeah, we met in art class, and it sounds a little corny, but I had an epiphany in this art class about her. And it was, I don't think I've ever talked about this, but we had a very, very straight-laced art history teacher that had kind of this short gray bob, and she was quite severe and angular, and always wore like fitted pantsuit, and I was like pretty much a stoner at that juncture, and so those things did not mix well. Right. And I was kind of always in the back of the classroom, avoiding her penetrating stare with every kind of ounce of energy that I could muster. And Skylar was in that class, and she was a dancer, a very serious dancer at that juncture. And she would come in these kind of talky leotards, and always late, because she must have had a class that kind of bumped up against it, and sit, kind of adjacent to me, and always pull out a grapefruit and peel it in class, and peel back the layers and send grapefruit droplets out into the world. And I remember there was a Bernini sculpture, which I believe was the ecstasy of Saint Teresa that would get, what was her name? Miss McCoo or something? I don't know. But she would put these slides up, and then she would talk about the piece of art on this big slide. And so she put this Bernini sculpture on. And if I remember correctly, this is an angel taking an arrow and holding it as if to penetrate the heart of Saint Teresa, who's kind of lying back in a state of spiritual ecstasy and epiphany. And I had this kind of strange vision that like I was this angel and I was abducting, this young saint who was Skylar. It's totally wacky.
You guys were dating at that time, I'm assuming.
No. This was before we were dating. This is before we were dating. Okay. And I was like, and then I became infatuated with her kind of through this vision, and would sort of sheepishly, in my burnt, stoned way, kind of, trail her from a distance. Not anything weird, but just I was just enamored with her. She did not walk with her feet on the ground. She kind of floated around. And she was, she was a Northern Californian transplant, grew up on a commune up in Sonoma County, and kind of had this kind of a hippie sophistication around her that I was just completely enamored with, and really pursued her. In all humility, the all-you-can-eat buffet was amply stocked for me at that juncture as far as potential female mates. But, I just was not interested in Sydney from Sydney, or I remember Narit, who became this really wonderful park ranger. There's a marine biologist. But no, anyways, I was not interested in any of these beautiful, talented women. Skylar was it for me. And so there was a long period of chivalry and pursuit that I engaged in, full of tribulations and whatnot. And Skylar comes from a relatively well-known family of strong, single women. She was not interested in a mate, getting married, having sex. None of these things were of interest to her. So I suppose I would categorize it as my longest and greatest conquest.
Were you thinking in terms of marriage at that time when you were in college?
Well, it's funny. My parents actually went through a very, very disruptive divorce that lasted 8 or 9 years, to be honest, and didn't finish until I was basically an adult. And my brother and I ended up staying with my dad, which was pretty rare at that juncture. So in retrospect, I'm not sure if I was looking for a girlfriend or a mother or some sort of combination of both, but I certainly hurdled an unrealistic complement of archetype expectations on Skylar. Everything from be my mother offering your nurturing breast, and also, be a feminist breadwinner, and also be my sexual partner. But she, in her amazing versatility and adeptness, somehow fulfilled all roles. But yeah, I could have gone the other direction of marriage, commitment, that stuff just doesn't work out. But I didn't. I went the other way. And, we've been together for 32 years.
Right. So now we're in college, Jeff. You're no longer fat, Jeff. You now are athletic, you're musical, you're smart, you're dating beautiful women you may even get married to one day. What's your mental health state like at this point? And what are you thinking about for career and, your contribution to the world?
Not much. So I was, as I alluded to briefly when talking about art class, I was a full on stoner at this juncture in my life. And I was also making an income from it.
That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, courtesy of the Columbia University football team, which, if you remember back in those days, did not have stellar results. Right. So I might take some credit for that. But yeah, they bankrolled my interest in music. And so at this juncture, I became absolutely obsessed with the banjo. And I played as much as I possibly could before class, in between class, after class. I became a DJ on WKCR, which was and remains actually a very, very respected and prominent college radio station in New York City. At that juncture, it was transmitted off the top of the World Trade Center. That's no longer there. So it had a significant signal, and it was known largely as a jazz station. It had this incredible guy named Phil Schaap, who kind of ran the radio station and was a jazz aficionado like no other, and wrote many of the liner notes for Columbia and for Columbia Records, actually, and a lot of for Miles Davis's records, and knew kind of every alternate take of everything. But and he became a little bit of my mentor, and then hooked me up with this show called Moonshine, which was a traditional American music show that aired every Sunday from 10 to 12. And I was the DJ on that show. And I put together a traditional American band, like a bluegrass band, basically played bluegrass and old time music. And then I met this guy, Bela Fleck, who became very, very influential. And I, followed him and got lessons from him, got lessons from his teacher named Tony Trischka. And I just was absolutely consumed by music. And the radio station gave me just enough stipend to go on the road with an old school tape recorder, and often with my band and with Skylar, who did not show a lot of initial interest in bluegrass, but she definitely came around. And we would go drive through the South, through North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and go to bluegrass festivals. And oftentimes I'd book my band as like the first of 20. We would play at like 8:30 in the morning, while there was nobody there. But that got me backstage, and I got an opportunity to interview kind of all that first generation bluegrass folks: Bill Monroe, Earl Scruggs, J.D. Crowe, Ralph Stanley. Can't even believe those names, right? And boy, I mean, what a crazy culture.
So let's hit pause for just a second. All right. So I want to understand when this is all happening. Are you still at Columbia when this is happening, or is this post graduation?
Yeah, this is still at Columbia. I'm a student at Columbia, but really my main interest is not being particularly academic.
So Columbia is not exactly a community college, right? So you have to have some academic skills to get into Columbia in the first place. I'm assuming the course load, it's got to be somewhat demanding. You're obsessed with the banjo. You're dealing drugs on the side. you're with this woman. You're stoner in these art classes. Who are your biggest supporters at this point? Was your granddad still around, the gypsy violinist, or who's like outside of your mentors in the music world? Who among your family and friends and the people that were around you, who was like saying, "Hey, Jeff, this is what," or were you having to not tell a lot of people about what you were doing because you knew that they were going to disapprove?
Yeah, I didn't have a tremendous amount there was not a lot of discipline in my life, or I would say there's not a lot of disciplinarian. No one played that disciplinarian role. My dad at this point, after my parents got divorced, kind of was holding down a pretty prestigious job, but also rocking Party Central at the house. And I would roll out there with tons of friends, and we had this whole crazy au pair community. And it was pretty raucous. And, at Columbia, I joined a fraternity, which was hardly qualified as a fraternity since it was co-ed, mostly women. But we had a house. It was Delta Phi, and Skylar joined too. And there was a ritual around joining that was absolutely insane. It's called the Odyssey, but it's a whole other podcast probably. And it became a music frat. And the president of the frat was this guy named Dave Graham, who was Bill Graham's son. So Bill Graham was a legendary promoter in the Bay Area, promoted Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane and tons of other stuff.
Not to be confused with Billy Graham, but go ahead.
That's true. Very different guys. And Dave started basically the East Coast version of Bill Graham Presents in our frat house. And it was called Music Unlimited. And we turned the basement into kind of rehearsal recording studio and started signing bands. And a lot of New York local bands, this one called Dreamspeak, one called Willard Moan, one called Blues Traveler, which you probably heard of, one called the Spin Doctors, which you probably heard of too. My band, and we took over this little club called the 712 Club up on 125th Street. And we were booking that. And then in the summers, Dave and all the frat guys would work for the Dead. So working parking lot, security, So for me, it was pretty unbelievable opportunity to dive head first into, my passion that was music, but also, be driving a golf cart around the Dead parking lot. It was pretty cool. And then Bill died in the helicopter crash. He and his girlfriend at the time, which was my drummer's mother. And that kind of just sent everything upside down and everything kind of collapsed. But, that music, all those guys, Dave Melody, Adam Schneider, all these guys that were kind of older, that were kind of the senior guys in Delta Phi, they became kind of like my music business. I don't know. I wouldn't call it mentors, but they're, we were making shit happen basically, at a pretty young age. And from the academic perspective, Columbia was, it's an Ivy League school, but it has a very particular curriculum called the core curriculum that's very, very humanities based. And to be honest, I had learned all that stuff already in high school. And my high school experience from an academic perspective was thorough and intense. I was at boarding school wearing a coat and tie, going to chapel, going to class on Saturdays. It was intense. And it basically carried me till today. So I wasn't top of my class or anything like that, but I was doing fine, kind of phoning it in. But my passion and my interest was elsewhere.
So when you were going on the bluegrass tour with Skylar, that was your first time really practicing being a manager? Because I'm assuming you were making all the bookings for your band?
Yeah, I was making the bookings, writing a lot of the tunes, organizing the recordings.
You're doing everything. You were
I did the freaking cover art. It was like.
What program did you use to do the cover art? Harvard Graphics?
To be honest, back then, I think I hand drew it.
Yeah.
And this might even be pre-Kinko's, but then printed it out, in a copy shop and cut it out. It was old school, and it was cassettes,
Right.
This was the deal. I was always like that. Skylar and I started a guacamole business briefly, where we did a bulk deal with Fairway, which was a market on the Upper West Side to get avocados in bulk. And I loved making guacamole. That was my big thing, kind of in high school through college was guacamole. And so, we would make guacamole, package it up, and, we'd bring it to the festivals. And, we were selling other things too. So there was, guacamole front. It was right out of Cheech and Chong. I mean, it was like guacamole front. And then, you pull up the secret compartment in the cooler, and underneath, you had your quarter ounces and your eighth ounces and things like that. So, that was it. It's just hustling. And then my band kind of got a little bit of traction. And, I was the dude, like 1:00, at the wetlands, people filing out. I would be the dude with the flyers. Like, here you go. Come and see my band. Come see my show. Here you go. Flyers. And I was always hustling like that. I was never really asked for a lot of help. I was like, okay, I got to make a flyer. I'll make a flyer. Oh, I got to get them distributed. Oh, I'll just distribute them. Oh, I got to get a gig. I'll just book the gig. Oh, I got to make the record. Oh, fuck it. I'll just buy the gear on eBay. That was it. Like I started a recording studio right when eBay first launched. I bought all the gear, ADATs, and I started a recording studio in 1995, something like that.
In your apartment in New York?
No, I got a little, I found a proper recording studio right by the World Trade Center, 2 blocks north. There was this kooky business. So, I graduated from college. I went to go work for RCA Records for a little while. That's kind of when you could actually make a lot of money in the music industry. And I had a real job and I saved some money. It was cool. But, I never really wanted to work for the man, if you will. So I rented this little spot that was associated with this business called the Off Wall Street Jam, which was basically a live studio where guys that worked on Wall Street would come in with a giant Foster's or two at 5:00, and they'd play rock and roll covers, Lay Down Sally all night. Just business dudes getting their rocks off and getting hammered. But but that was 5 to 8, 5 to 9. So otherwise the studio was not being used. So I did a deal with that guy, Bill, crazy motherfucker. Oh my God. And to rent the use of the studio at all the other hours of the day. And we did that. And I built with Sean, who's my best friend, who also went to Columbia, who eventually started Wanderlust with, etc. I built a recording studio there, kind of patched together a bunch of gear off eBay. And I put an ad. I was a one-man show at that point. Sean was a lawyer. He didn't leave the business, his law firm, until later. But I just took out ads in the Village Voice, and I was answering the phone, and I was the engineer. And there'd be just people coming off the street. I produced probably 100 hip hop demos. I had to learn everything. I had to make.
You were a hip hop producer?
I wouldn't. I'm not Timba.
You're not
but
Puff,
I'm
Puff
not,
Daddy.
But I was in there.
Because that was back in the day. That was during the Puff Daddy era, back in the mid 90s.
Yeah, this was
in New York City.
This was mid late 90s. Yeah, and I had my MPC 2000, and that was it. That's where all the beats were made on that. But I also could play instruments, so I could sample. I had my ASR. So I was sampling all myself, and then I built this huge library of samples and beats, and then cats would come in, and all they'd have were rhymes written down in notebooks. So they didn't have most of the time they didn't even have the beats. So I was just throwing together beats and engineering, producing, and then burning a CD, and they'd walk out with that. And most of those sessions, how that rolled, that it was we'd roll out of there 5, 6 in the morning, every night. And that was some crazy hustle for a bunch of those years.
Did any of those songs blow up?
No. I mean, not that I know of, but what happened was during that time, my brother, he was crashing at my place a lot. And he's like, yeah, I'm going to go see these cats. They're like, these two other brothers. They're living up in Woodstock. And I need a place to crash. And anyways, for a couple of days before I go to Boston. And I'm like, all right, well, cool. Let me know how it goes. And then he called me. He went to Woodstock and played a couple, like, wrote some tunes with these guys and called me. It was like, this band is crazy. It's going to be incredible. And I was like, all right. And so I decided I was going to manage them and sign them to what? I don't know at that point. I didn't have anything, but I was like, I'm going to sign you guys. And they came down and we recorded an album in this studio that I had that at that point was called Full Tilt Studios. And that band was Soul Live. And we ended up around the world selling about 250,000 records, which was, it's not a Taylor Swift, but for me, that was a significant deal over time. And that kind of just broke me into, it actually made me decide of whether I was going to be a musician or whether I was going to be in the music business. And at that juncture, I said, okay, I can't be kind of mediocre at both. So I'm going to go into the music business. And then I ended up starting to do distribution deals around the world and signing more artists and building like a cool little indie management company and record label. And, was managing all sorts of different acts and had all of our bands all over festivals and putting tours together and making records. And I did a big deal with Starbucks, which kind of was in and of its time like a big deal for us. And yeah, really, I managed Michelle.
Was that the one where where Starbucks was selling music for the first time and doing like compilations and stuff like that?
Yeah, exactly. This was they early like the record business, as digital became more prevalent, started to get shaky. And Starbucks kind of emerged as a very prominent and influential player for retailing CDs. Because, Tower Records started closing, Virgin Megastore started closing, CD sales were all down. And, Starbucks did two records. They did Norah Jones, the first Norah Jones record, and then the Ray Charles record with Concord. And they would put them there right by the register, like right where you checked out. And they would play the music in the overhead speakers. And it was just impulse buys. And they were just cranking records. I mean, they were selling huge amounts of those records. But it was, particular vein, it was for that.
It was coffee shop music.
Yeah, coffee shop music. They basically kind of invented the genre of coffee shop music. But, it was kind of bougie. It wasn't too loud and intense or anything like that. And I was in there and I was like, wow, this could be really a saving grace for selling records. And I had gotten a demo sent to me by a 13-year-old girl. And, we would get demos in all the time on cassettes, And I got a demo from this 13-year-old girl. And most of the time you wouldn't even listen to them. But for some reason I popped it in and I was like, oh my God, this girl, not even a woman, this girl had this voice of an angel and she was writing songs at 13. So I went up to see her. She was from Western Mass and she was playing gigs at this little place called Club Helsinki, which at that point was in Great Barrington. It moved to Hudson, but it was a very reputable club, small, but they always had cool, really high quality artists playing there. So I went to go see her show and she had a band and she, was 13. She was giggly and kind of goofy, but once she played and started singing, it was remarkable. And so I hung out after with her and her mom. And I said, hey, have you, I know you write some songs. What's up? And she took out like 3 or 4 notebooks just full of songs. And I was like, oh my God. And in the very first time I met her, in the back of my mind, I was like, oh my God, this should be in Starbucks, But of course, there was thousands of people in the music industry saying that in the back of their minds. But I signed that girl. Her name was Sonia Kitchell, and she became a very, very, very good friend. And I produced this record of hers. I wrote a lot of the string parts, and I was so involved in it, and produced really just a beautiful record. And I give her all the credit. They were all her songs. Right. And I knew one person at Starbucks, not even in the music department, but I weaved my way slowly through the labyrinth of a very big company till I finally found this one guy, Bill Corey, who then introduced me to this other woman named Brenda Walker, and who was coming to New York. And I met her at the W Hotel, and I was like, you just got to listen to this. I know that this is just perfect for Starbucks. And we did it. We did the biggest independent deal that had ever been done with Starbucks up to that time around this kind of discovery artist. And yeah, they stocked hundreds of thousands of those records for us. And that was it's a beautiful.
So that was bigger than Soul Live was then for you.
Yeah, it was kind of the next building block. Yeah, it was significant and really like solidified the company's well-being for a while because it was dodgy. I think it was, more than anything, it was almost like an acknowledgement. It was sort of like a recognition of like, you guys are doing good work and the world deserves to hear it.
Talk about 9/11, and you said you were 2 blocks north of the tower. So what was that experience like for you?
It was intense. I mean, we would go up on the roof because our studio was on the top floor. It wasn't a very tall building, maybe four or five stories, but we could go on the roof and do what musicians do on roofs, which is not read Rousseau. Well, that's what I'm doing now. And we would look at the World Trade Center. We would look at the Twin Towers. And in order to look at them, we would literally have to crane our necks all the way back and look straight up. And we would often wonder, we'd be like, God, man, if those things ever fell over, whoa. So yeah, we were real close. And yeah, all that stuff happened. We actually ended up moving a block away before 9/11, but we were still right there, but we needed some more office space. And then 9/11 happened, and we were in such the tight radius that we were not able to access our office for a number of months. I think maybe 2 or 3 weeks out, they gave us a little window to go in and collect some affairs. And we got in the office, and it like debris and dust had just been blown through the entire office space. So, it was like super intense time, to live in New York during that time. I mean, it was in some ways an incredibly beautiful time because there was this incredible sense of connection that emerged out of the collective grief that people were feeling. Not completely unlike now, but also very different because you could be social with people. And, there was a lot of, people sort of random acts of kindness and people high-fiving and hugging in the subways and on the sidewalks and stuff that like cut through kind of the normal distinctions that people make around race and religion and culture and ethnicity. And like, it was really kind of brought people together in a beautiful way for a while. And, like these huge kind of traumatic, oftentimes in these kind of times of crisis and trauma, it inspires people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. So kind of in the aftermath of that, my wife Skylar decided to open a yoga studio right above me in the same building because most of the people had vacated our building at that juncture. Just because it was too intense. So she opened Kula Yoga Project and opened the doors in early 2002, just right there out of the ashes of 9/11, right at ground zero.
Was she still selling guacamole up until that point, or what was her, what was her deal?
No, we had graduated a little bit from some of the
shenanigans.
Wayward madcap shenanigans of our youth. She became a video editor for a little while, and then she comes from a relatively prolific acting family, so she had been doing theater all of her life. And just prior to that, she had an agent, and she got booked. Not Young and the Restless. What's the other one? The famous one with the Erica soap opera.
As the World Turns.
Give me one more. It's the other like really big one. I can't believe I can't.
Days of Our Lives.
Yeah. Anyways, but I'll remember it in a moment. I was on ABC, so she was on soap opera for a year and a half or something like that. And she at first was like, "I'm never want to do this. I'm never going to do this." And she's like, "You're going to pay me what?"
All my children.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And, they gave her own like little mini apartment in that ABC building on the Upper West Side. And she was like, "Oh, this is pretty good." And so she had a little run on All My Children. And then one day was reading her sides and discovered through reading her sides that she was going to be blown up in a boiler room accident on the show. And that was it. Her character was written out. Daisy, who was a very popular character, had settled her contract dispute and was coming back on the show to be the main love interest. So Skylar was no longer needed. And at that juncture, she decided, like, I'm never going to do this again. I'm not going to be at the whim of, a casting agent or a writer or a contract. I just need to take control of my own life. And she, had been an avid yoga student and then had done a yoga teacher training, and that had stemmed from way back when she had been run over by a wayward hippie driving a VW bus. So I always had back problems and had kind of cured those largely with yoga. And so, right after 9/11, she opened Kula, which in Sanskrit means intentional community. And, I had a front row seat to the power of that little humble, funky yoga studio to, really heal and transform people in a very kind of hyperbolized situation. And, a lot of people think of the financial district as largely just a business district, but it's actually quite significant residential district. And I just got to see firsthand kind of mostly women, who were going through a tremendous amount of shock and trauma and grief, come into that little studio and sweat it out on the mat, and then go into this tiny little lobby vestibule with like a futon couch and just share and open up their hearts and be vulnerable and hug it out and cry it out and heal and eventually rediscover their spark and their creativity. So, I saw just that transformative power of yoga, but also community. And that really bent the arc of my kind of professional life going forward.
So what was the extent of your yoga experience before she opened up her studio?
Very limited. That was not part of my experience growing up at all. My yoga experience was just through her. And I was not a practitioner, but I highly associated with the values of yoga, which at that juncture, I wasn't exactly clear what those were. But for me, there seemed to be a component of progressiveness, of course, like nonviolence and ahimsa, but I wasn't really hip to exactly what that all was or the tradition of that. But I resonated with this notion of like, okay, the people that practice yoga tend to be progressive. They tend to value sustainability. They tend to value community. They tend to be, non-discriminatory, like essentially all the things that all my socio-political beliefs seem to lay very squarely on top of that yoga community. So I was like, okay, this is cool. I like this scene.
And what was your satisfaction level with the music industry at that point?
It was still, there was a lot of this kind of overlapped. The timelines really do overlap. And, as it got to be kind of later in the 2000s, in the first decade of the 2000s, the music business was so tricky. But I also started to feel a pull towards making a bigger impact with my life, devoting my energy and my time to what I would call now right work and action. But I suppose at that point, just having a greater sense of meaning to my work. And it took me a long time to figure out how to manifest that, to be honest, because, Skylar has, that studio instantiated in 2002, early 2002. And, I didn't start Wanderlust till 2008, 2009. So it was a long gestation period of kind of really understanding what I wanted to do. It wasn't until my late 30s that I somehow figured out how to kind of align my passion with what I do every single day, day in and day out. Now, I don't want to say that I wasn't passionate about music, because I obviously was, but I was very, I became so business focused, and I wasn't, and I don't mean to undermine music's ability to create a lot of joy and help people, but I just found a more direct line later.
What was your mental state like at the time? Feeling pretty balanced?
Overall, yeah. Overall, yes. I always worked out a lot, so that really helped. I played a ton of basketball, like a ridiculous, almost to the point of absurd amount of basketball. And that kept me fit and focused and present. I love basketball. And I had sort of a very unfortunate and sad ending with it. But
I was going to say, every guy I know who plays that much basketball in his 30s ends up pulling something or tearing something at some point.
Yeah. I hung up my high tops once and for all at one. It was one very specific incident that was enough, because it was really, unfortunately, it was disrupting my life in a way that was not acceptable from a physical capacity. But that really helped me during that time. But I will say, I was a bit of a zombie. I was just kind of going through life's to-do lists. I'd wake up, I was busy. I always filled my days with a tremendous amount of busyness. I was always at the bottom of my own priority list from a self-care perspective. Basketball was great, but it wasn't exactly self-care per se. So, I was good, but, I wasn't really focused on kind of bettering myself. I don't think I read a book for 15 years, And, I got into that mode. I'm working all day and drinking coffee in the morning and drinking beers or wine at night and just grinding and working all day. And that's kind of it. I mean, I don't, again, mean to really demean it, because I traveled all over the place. We were going to Asia. We were going to Japan all the time. I went to every festival in the United States, got, to meet every musician. I mean, it was great on some level, but it wasn't enlightened. It was not an enlightened existence.
And when did you realize that it was time to shift? What was that moment like?
Skylar started leading retreats, and mostly in Costa Rica. And so I became kind of hip to her yoga community, the Kula scene, because they were upstairs. And so then, I would start to tag along on some of these retreats, and, we'd fly into San Jose and then drive to some other random airport and take a puddle jumper to Puerto Jimenez, and then get in the back of a truck and bounce out on this road for an hour. And then there we'd be, there we were, like 30 people, mostly women in their late 20s, early 30s, like waking up with the sun, meditating, surfing, doing yoga, making food, local food. It wasn't really local food. It was just the food that was growing there. And then, at night, like telling stories and playing music and having a glass of wine, like basically living the most inspired, connected life that you could lead. And so like, I was like, man, this is it. This is people really being in community, really caring for each other, having real conversations, being healthy. This is what life should be all about. But it's also like in this far-flung rainforest on the Osa Peninsula, just completely divorced from what is reality for most people. And, it's also, there was an economic component to it. It's like, that was interesting, but also exclusive, which was like, okay, it's not like these women that were on these retreats were wealthy per se, but they were willing to essentially spend all their disposable income on this experience and on this lifestyle. But not everybody could do that. And so I started, really thinking about like how I could alloy kind of the experience I had from the music business, which was like a lot of nuts and bolts of like production and bringing product to market and look and feel and design and website functionality and ticketing, and with the values and the practices of yoga and the associated modalities that I wasn't totally aware of at that juncture, but now I am. And really, the inspiration for kind of the shift in my own personal life, but then also what became, Wanderlust, happened there and in the bowels of the rainforest, with kind of the idea of like, well, geez, if I could put this experience closer to a major metropolitan center, but still somewhere beautiful, and bring together a lot of incredible teachers, it was pretty simple. It was like, could I make the world's biggest yoga retreat? Could I do 3,000 people instead of 30? And I wasn't afraid to build the stages on top of the mountains and put, with sound and lights and all of that, because that was my reality. I knew that.
Right.
So, that's where that idea had its seed. And then, there was a whole, process of realizing and manifesting the seed of that idea.
Had you saved up money and you were going to invest your own money, or did you look for sponsors, or what was the next step for funding this dream?
We needed investors, and dude, I was so naive. Like, I'm not an MBA, obviously. And at that juncture, I literally followed instinct and heart. That's it. I could barely function in Excel, let alone, build a 5-year pro forma or a business plan or any financial plan. So, I put together what I thought was the best little deck I could in PowerPoint, and started like going around and trying, to raise some money. And this was the fall of 2008. So it's not the greatest time in the world to raise money. And so I think we raised the money 3 different times. And each time, when
the carpet got swept up from underneath you every time.
Every time, yeah. Even to the point where we were done. And my community of people that I knew was in the music business. So that's where I went. So we had Universal. They were done. They were in. We were good to go. We had 1 million conference calls, 1 million meetings. It was sort of a strange partner for the idea. And then we had a couple other folks. But we did eventually get investment in a strange, rickety joint venture
with Dave Matthews' manager or something like that, right?
Yeah, with Corin Capshaw, who had, funded Bonnaroo and Outside Lands and part owner in South by Southwest. And anyways, and then the C3 guys that did Austin City Limits and Lollapalooza. So we were well covered from a festival perspective. And, those guys became our partners, but, it was quickly clear, like, what we did was so different on some level culturally from, big stages with 60,000 people that largely based on Budweiser sales, But it was great to have those partners, and, it got us off the ground. And man, it was a long, strange trip from there, from launching one festival in Squaw Valley in Lake Tahoe, California, to 68 in 20 countries 10 years later.
So when you first came to Sean with the idea after Costa Rica, was he on board right away, or did you have to kind of convince him and sell him a little bit on the idea?
Yeah, there was some convincing for sure, but he was my partner in the music business. So we were already had been partners for a long time, and he had come down to Costa Rica. So he understood, he got it, but it was a little bit of convincing to completely pivot the business.
Right.
And the idea was not to completely pivot the business. We had every intention of continuing to run the record label and the management company, and then just do Wanderlust on the side. And that's how, and, pretty quickly it became more than a side project. And then, C3 ended up buying the management company. So we got out, in a way that made it worthwhile and allowed us to focus all of our energy and efforts on building Wanderlust for better or worse.
So what was the first experience in Squaw Valley like in terms of your expectations and what was going on behind the scenes versus, what everyone saw on the stage?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, for me, yoga, meditation, music, nature, sustainability, organics, biodynamic wine, like that was all made a lot of sense to me, because that was essentially like how I was living my life. That was just kind of like Skylar and our lifestyle. But, and this is often the case with me, is that I just assume that my lifestyle is pretty much everybody else's. And so I just took for granted the notion that all those things go together, But when we went to market, it was like fucking crickets, man. We used to call it in the music business the whale watch. There was nothing.
The whale watch.
I mean, I've got so many stories about launching it, but basically I was at Bonnaroo, which was in June. It's like June 10th or something around there. And our first festival in 2009 at Squaw Valley was end of July. And we'd probably sold maybe 100 tickets, tops. So I'm backstage with a bunch of my music industry guys, and this guy named Matt Hickey, he was like, "So what's up? You selling any tickets?" I'm like, "No, man, whale watch." And he's like, "This is what you got to do. You got to drive back to Nashville. You're going to fly back to New York. You're going to pack up your family, and you're going to move to Lake Tahoe, and you're going to get yourself a truck or a station wagon, and you're going to fill it with free tickets, and you're going to fill it with posters, and you're going to fill it with flyers, and you're going to buy yourself a staple gun, and you're going to get some rolls of tape, and you are going to get a big map, and you're going to put it on your wall, and you're going to circle every town, every bar, every event, every farmer's market, every beach, and every day you're going to go out and you're going to explain what the fuck this thing is, and you're going to hand people tickets for free. Anyone that makes any sense, radio station, DJs, bar managers, hotel managers, just give it away." And that's exactly what I did. Went back to New York, packed up my family, got a Volvo station wagon and filled it up. And my daughter, Phoebe, was super young at that point, and she went out with me a lot. And every day I was the most grassroots thing you could possibly imagine. I was there at the freaking 7-Eleven, putting up posters. They'd get ripped down. Go back the next day, put them up. I was on the radio station every morning at 8 a.m. I mean, this is KTKE, which is like where the radio station was in the back of like a barbecue joint. And I was there trying to explain, yoga, music, nature. I got it at least that simple. Yoga, music, nature. You get that? And people are like, huh? What? Yoga and music and the nature? I don't get it. But I did that, for 50 days or something. And then the night, Michael Franti, who was our headliner, and the night before his headlining show, first year festival, burst his appendix. So I had to deal with that and somehow pulled Common out of my ass, and Common flew out from Philly with his band and filled in.
How are you paying these guys if you only sold 150 tickets?
Well, I mean, we were lucky to have investors that would essentially stand behind the risk. Mm-hmm. They absorbed some serious red in that first year, but they knew that game. They had launched plenty of festivals, and festivals in their first year often lose money. We lost an impressive amount for the scale of the event. But I had given away probably 2,500 tickets. Mm-hmm. So it didn't feel bad. It felt pretty good. Like there was a critical mass of people there. And in year one, it was not the iteration. It was an iterative development for Wanderlust. In year one, we basically ran a music festival with a yoga component. It was like some considerable music names. And, as I was assessing that experience in that first year, I was like, okay, we got hosed financially, and there was a lot of things to be concerned about, but there was something interesting happening. There was a glimmer of something, of magic dust, of fairy dust. And that was like this mashup of the DJs with Shiva Ray on a big stage with a sound system and lights, and like people doing yoga and getting up and dancing and being in community together and being at one with the nature, and then going off and doing hikes. I mean, there was something new and fresh and interesting, because at that juncture, the only kind of yoga gatherings that had existed were yoga journal conferences, which were like, in fluorescent carpeted Hyatts. Mm-hmm. And so that first year was very easy to recognize that, like, okay, we need to focus the whole experience on this yoga experience, this yoga lifestyle, all of the kind of the diaspora of what that was and what that meant. And then, and then we kind of from there really honed it in and focused it in. And those first few years were so exciting. That's always kind of the most exciting part, when you're kind of building something from scratch, and, you see that there's some enthusiasm and energy around it. And, you feel like you're innovating. And so those first few years were really, really special. And we, I think we were a big part of establishing a part of the culture, and also really, by the time we were done, cementing that lifestyle of all of those things actually going together. That all these things that seemed disparate, like green juice and yoga and nature and sustainability and all those things that I had mentioned before, that now those things are seen as part of an overall kind of set of active choices that you can make as a bigger part of like how you want to live your life. And I think we played some part in helping to establish that.
We could obviously do a whole podcast just on your various Wanderlust stories and experiences, but I'm sure a lot of those stories are already out there in podcast land. Tell me a little bit about, because you're in an interesting position now. You've actually transitioned away from the day-to-day operations of Wanderlust. The event has scaled down a bit in the recent couple of years. Looking back now at the body of work that is Wanderlust, what is the takeaway for you as now 50-year-old Jeff with all the life experiences from Babito on the playground throughout the music industry and sort of finding your own true north in this festival experience and into commune, which is what you're up to now? What is the takeaway from the Wanderlust sort of body of work?
Well, I will say that I had a bit of a spiritual awakening, I suppose, kind of towards the end of my operational role at Wanderlust, which has given me what I would say some good perspective on it. I think it's really important now more than ever to build things at human scale. And I think for many, many years at Wanderlust, I was so intoxicated by the potential growth that, we were going to be part of leading this kind of global cultural revolution around well-being. And there was no limit to the amount of events that we would do. And over that time, all of a sudden it was like, 100 plus employees plus, all of these partners all around the world, like many of whom I didn't even know their names. And when I look at like what it became, yes, it certainly became like a much, much more commercial experience. And I take full responsibility for that because I led that part of the business. I'm the one that did all of the deals with Jody, with Toyota and Ford and Google and Adidas and all that kind of stuff. And in retrospect, I look at what made Wanderlust kind of successful from a financial perspective, and it was really those deals. And as I think about it, why were those people so attracted to what we were doing? Yeah, certainly we represented we were sort of gatekeepers to a certain demographic that certain brands wanted access to. And, we were creating these sticky, memorable experiences that they could connect to. But really, it was more the language that we were using around growth and globalism and all of these kind of notions of being big and bigger was better. And, how many more events are we going to add this year? And then the pressure that would put on staffing and sponsorship and grow and grow and grow and grow. And because we were coming from that mentality and often using that language and spending most of my time thinking about that or flying to corporate headquarters around the world in order to generate enough money to be able to execute this and that and stuff like that, that is what you become. And in a way, it's like the systems and structures that govern our lives, if they are devoid of the heart of, I would call, spiritual principles, then how are they supposed to serve spiritual beings? And, I think that was my big learning is that scale and growth does not even remotely equate to success. And that building systems and structures that are aligned with your highest principles is the best and most righteous work that you can do. Building systems and structures at human scale to serve humans by humans, that is the most righteous work that you can do. Wayne Dyer, man, one piece of advice that I got from him was, and I didn't even realize what I was getting. Stay close to the work. And of course, what he was talking about was spiritual work. He traveled the world and did a ton of events, but he was never at like the big dinners or the social events. He was back in the hotel doing the work. And, that's what I I think, in my sort of wide-eyed quest to grow, which, to take it full circle, was not completely disconnected from my obsession with the approval of others, with Bobito and the other kids on that schoolyard. That I, in many ways, needed to feel a sense of ease and self-love. I needed to be recognized for doing something big by other people. And in a way, I don't think that was in the best interest of the company or any company, So that's, where I, sit today, with some degree of removal, and just, a larger toolkit is stay close to the work, stay close to the heart, build at human scale. And then, that's, I think, in COVID-19, there's no better time to address, corporate globalisms, systems and structures that have essentially turned human beings into transactional units that, consistently define people by who they are and what they do and their resume and what they have, constantly make people feel like they're not enough, and then, market goods and services to them to assuage that perceived deficiencies. We have this opportunity now to take stock of our lives and reprioritize and reconnect with the things that made life worthwhile and precious and sacred. There's a fantastic book that Charles Eisenstein wrote called Sacred Economics, and he writes about sacred. What is the meaning of sacred? And sacred are things that are unique, that they are not standardized or commodified in the name of operational efficiency, that, your grandmother made that dress, or and in retrospect, I think about that with Wanderlust, the creativity and that we were able to connect around when we had two festivals that were, by the way, extremely profitable and transformational for people. When we had two, boy, could we make them unique? Could we make them special? Could we make them sacred? And I just think we need that across everything that we do, whether it's a festival or a loaf of bread.
I want to offer a reflection here, just hearing how you kind of summarized the body of work that is Wanderlust. And I still want to mention commune and what that's about for you right now, but it kind of reminds me the eternal struggle of Batman.
You're going to tie that back. I love it.
Batman being this, and one of the things that I think makes him unique in the scheme of all the other superheroes is he was a regular guy. He didn't really have any superpowers. He wasn't born with any superpowers. He kind of made a decision that I'm going to move in this direction and I'm going to help people who are helpless, who can't help themselves. And from what I'm hearing from you is your sort of purpose that you fell into is one of helping people find themselves. Instead of some big villain, the obstacle that I think most people have, myself included, is buying into the social conditioning that more is better, bigger is better, and success is equated with how much you have in the bank and how many connections and how much resources you have. And I think the ethos of Wanderlust, which is bringing people back to themselves, is so important right now with everything that's happening with the pandemic, because it's almost like we're being forced into that and forced to sit with ourselves
And it's interesting that you kind of, through that experience, you went through the entire trajectory and that internal struggle between what is too much and what is not enough. And that's kind of, I'm not a huge comic book fan, but I've seen all the Batman movies, and that's kind of his struggle that he goes through. And I'm not sure how conscious you were of that back when you were, 7 or 8 years old, but it's just interesting to see how I've done a lot of these interviews, and I always start with childhood and your favorite activity. And it's just interesting to see how those kinds of things, and maybe I'm stretching a little bit, I don't know, but it's interesting to see how they can line up when we look at them from the sort of broader lens of maturity and the wisdom that we get from our life experience. Does that resonate with you at all? Or
it does. I mean, I love the metaphor, and I love the way that you've brought it back around in an interesting and coherent way. And certainly, I think that there is something around, I like the idea of, the average guy that can somehow put on a mask and a cape to make himself exceptional. What I think often as I try to weave a thread through my entire life, what I often come back to, it's the notion of community, and how desperately I sought it out when I was a kid, and then how I subconsciously manifested that through my whole life of essentially putting people together in clubs and theaters and festivals, to Wanderlust, to commune. And that has been the thread, if I can identify anything. And there is this idea that I've thought about, is you can have a band on a stage at sound check, and they might be playing the most brilliant music, but if there's no one there, it doesn't really resonate or mean anything. And 4 hours later, you pack that place full of 1,000 people, and that are experiencing something, and that feeling when there is a musical crescendo and you look around the theater or the club and everyone has that same rapt expression on their face, and they're all feeling the same. It's as if they're not even themselves, that they have transcended, they've become the music, they've transcended what generally defines our human reality, space, time, location, and form, and they've become one another. They've transcended self. And of course, that's at the core of every spiritual, teaching. And, that has become kind of what I have started to understand spirituality as being. It's recognizing kind of this interconnectivity. I suppose it's like recognizing that we're all connected by a power that's greater than us. And what better pursuit for your life than fostering that?
Mm-hmm. And talk a little bit about commune and how that experience with Wanderlust is dovetailing into that, and what are you doing differently?
Well, certainly, the relationships that I was incredibly fortunate that Wanderlust basically facilitated for me in every way over the course of, a long time, have been, that's been the holy grail for me, is being able to build friendships and relationships with people that have altered the course of my life, that have impacted me and others, people that I respect. So being able to build kind of this broad, I guess, portfolio of relationships with mostly with teachers, and then find a way kind of with a human scale infrastructure to create a lot of impact with that. And that's really, exciting. And at the core, what we do is, create online education featuring kind of top respected teachers, across spiritual and personal development, yoga and meditation, functional medicine, social impact. But, this business, I suppose it can create a lot of impact but with a very human way. So yeah, I mean, I'm enjoying it a lot. I get to, I mean, like you, I'm hosting a podcast, and that has been a fantastic experience for me because it keeps me learning. Because every week for 94 weeks in a row, I'm interviewing someone who is not only smarter than me, but also has a particular expertise. So by extension, just out of fear of embarrassment, if nothing else, I have to, push myself and challenge myself and read a tremendous amount and listen. And that has been a fantastic growth opportunity for me personally.
I love it. Well, I definitely going to include all of the commune information in the show notes to the podcast. I like to end the interview by asking the question: if someone were to come to you and say that they wanted to start a movement in the way that you've started your movement, if you didn't have a whole lot of time to kind of get into the details, what advice would you give to them?
I mean, I suppose you have to move yourself before you move anyone else. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've been doing a lot of writing recently, and if I'm not moved, if my heart doesn't leap while I'm writing, then that particular piece is bound for the dustbin. So I would just always underscore the importance of really moving yourself before you try to move anyone else. And I think that goes back to that notion of really staying close and honoring the work. And, from a business perspective, I think, that also speaks to aligning your core mission with the profitability or sustainability of your company. So just making sure that those things are completely overlapped. Like at Commune, it's like we wrote on the wall, we want to bring well-being to 1 billion people. And guess what? If we do that, I bet the company's bottom line is going to look pretty damn good, And I always kind of question when I see like, oh yeah, ExxonMobil has a sustainability mission. That anachronism doesn't work.
Right.
Like Martin Luther King, is not going to lead a civil rights movement while also running like a used car, facility or whatever. It's just like, this is what the authentic life has become to mean for me. The life with integrity is aligning your works and actions with your highest principles, irrespective of external conditions. Just stick with that, and be ready. Just do the work and be ready. And
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, I want to acknowledge you, man, for your commitment to your mission and your generosity to the yoga community and the meditation and mindfulness community, for sharing your experience and you've made the world a better place. There are people out there right now who have, including myself. I've been to several Wanderlust festivals, as you know, and I've got fond memories from those experiences. And there are people I'm sure who were at some amazing concerts years and years ago, and they have fond memories. There's some guy down in Florida who remembers getting this amazing guacamole one time at this bluegrass festival, years and years ago.
I'll give you the first two. The last one, I'm not sure, but if you don't mind, I want to say one last thing, which is actually, it's been so gratifying, is this over the last month. And I mentioned this to you, I think, in a voice note, but I've been doing quite a bit of writing, and fortunately, we've built a very large database. So I get to circulate that out once a week on a Sunday. And in the postscript of that goes out to, I think, about 850,000 people now, I offer frontline workers and anyone that has lost their employment due to COVID-19 free access to your meditation course.
Thank you.
And I get probably 300 or 400 emails that go into a particular email box every week. And I answer every single one of them personally.
Wow.
And that's, I guess I would call my dharma or my commitment during this time of what I can do. And, some people just email me and say, I lost my job. Can I have the meditation course? And I say, sure, I'll set you up and this is how it goes. But I would say 1 out of every 3 or 4 emails is a long personal story.
Mm.
And then I respond, I read them all, and I respond, and I get to gift them your work. And it's such a great gift to me to be able to do that. And I have received so much gratitude from people. And these are nurses, frontline workers, delivery people, other healthcare professionals, people on the supply chain, grocery store workers. I mean, it's heavy, heavy, heavy stories that I'm absorbing and that I get to alleviate with some meditation. And so I'm grateful to you for just being able to do that. And I know how grateful those folks are for you as well.
Well, I was really impressed at the time when we shot that a few years ago. And, we thought we were shooting it for Wanderlust TV, but turns out we were shooting it to help people during a pandemic that was going to be happening 3 years later. We just didn't know it. So thanks so much for facilitating that and putting such great care into the production value of that, because I think it really does stand the test of time. And it is one of the offerings that I'm most proud of. And I'm so happy when you announced that you were offering that to essential workers. So
it's been great.
Beautiful, man.
All
well,
right,
thank
buddy.
you.
Yeah.
It's a great conversation. I think we got to everything for the most part. Have you and Babito connected over Facebook over the last 20 years? Or whatever happened with him?
He has not shown up, but I do plan to publish this little piece that I wrote about that experience. And who knows, maybe he will surface and we will break bread and make amends at some point.
Yeah, we got to do a Where Are They Now addition to this podcast so we know where all the characters, your grandfather, the gypsy, all these people. So anyways, thank you so much. And if people want to reach out to you or get a copy of that meditation course, what's the best way to contact you?
Yeah, my email, which is just jeffk@onecommune.com, jeffk@onecommune.com, and comes right into my Mac mail here. And as you know, I respond to everyone.
And are you on Instagram much?
Yeah,
Twitter?
I'm on Instagram at Jeff Krasno. I will rant and rave on Instagram on a regular basis.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you again. And I look forward to crossing paths with you very soon.
Yeah, we surely will.
Thank you for listening to my interview with Jeff Krasno. I'm so glad that he could join me to share his amazing story of perseverance and connection. And I hope it inspired you to go out and find your North Star. That is, what is the thing that makes your heart sing, that thing that lights you up inside like a Christmas tree? If you want to hear more stories like Jeff's, subscribe to the podcast and check out the archive. I've got so many other amazing interviews with people who started large and small movements, usually against all odds. I'm talking mental health challenges, financial challenges, physical challenges. Pretty much any obstacle you can think of, somebody overcame it to start a movement. And usually it was the obstacle itself that was the catalyst for the movement. And if you like what you hear, please rate the podcast. It really does help other listeners discover these inspirational stories. And as always, you can find everything that Jeff and I discussed in the show notes, as well as a transcript of our interview below. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next week with a new conversation from the end of the tunnel.